Hello once again, my friends. It is time for another couple of chapters of the Shakespeare Stealer. So here we go. Though I had been transported by the magic of these players, I had no thought in the world that I would become one of them. I thought only of doing what I had been hired to do. I meant to retrieve my table book, or, failing that, to seek an opportunity to transcribe the play again. Better yet, I might yet manage to make off with the theatre's copy, saving myself a good deal of toil and trouble. Now, Mr. Imogen said, who would like to be responsible for this boy? Mr. Pope clapped a heavy hand on my shoulder. I suppose I can make room for one more. He's not very large. You don't eat much, do you, lad? I hardly can, sir. I've never had the chance to find out. This, said in all seriousness, earned me a laugh from the players. I had been laughed at for being a fool, but never for being witty. I found it pleased me. Well answered, Mr. Pope said. Come then. Goodwife Willingson will be waiting supper for us. As he ushered me through the door, he called over his shoulder, Sander! Coming! A voice from the far side of the room replied. As we passed behind the stage, I glanced furtively about for the incriminating table book. The boy Mr. Pope had called Sander caught up with us just outside the rear door. He was of an age with me, but nearly a head taller, and as thin as Banbury cheese. Widge, said Mr. Pope, shake hands with Alexander Cook, known familiarly as Sander. The boy pumped my hand as though he expected me to spout water. Welcome to the company, Widge. It's a lot of work, but it's fun as well. Work? I thought. What could be so difficult about dressing up in fine clothing and saying witty and poetic things already written out for you? The rain had dwindled to a fine drizzle, what we in Yorkshire called a cobweb day. We were soaked by the time we reached Mr. Pope's home, though it lay a mere 5 minutes' walk from the Globe. All the way there I cast my eyes about furtively, wondering if Falconer would return to find me. Sander, said Mr. Pope, see if you can hunt up a change of clothing for Widge. He looks as though he's been wrestling pigs. Sander led me upstairs to a small dormer room. The walls were papered with hundreds of broadsides and ballad sheets, plus playbills for half a dozen theatres. While I looked them over, Sander rummaged through an iron-bound chest and tossed me a short cosy tunic and a pair of plain breeches. Try those. I've outgrown them. I've grown out of them. As we changed, I glanced about the room. You had this all to yourself. Until now. Oh, I'm sorry. He shrugged. I don't mind. It'll give me somebody to talk to and to study lines with. They let you perform in the plays? Sometimes, not the one today. Usually I play a serving maid or some such. So you hadn't a copy of Hamlet? Sander laughed. No one gets a copy of the whole play. But then how do you con your speeches? Learn the lines, you mean? Oh, you get a little sheaf of paper we call a side, and with just your part on it. You'll see. But there has to be a copy of the whole play somewhere, I insisted. Of course. The bookkeeper keeps it under lock and key. People filch them sometimes, you know, do their own version. It hurts our box then. Box? That's the money you take in, I said, recalling Simon Bass's words. Right, but the worst of it is, they don't give Mr. Shakespeare a farthing for it. And it is his work, after all. He gave my new attire a critical glance. That looks well enough. A bit loose, but clean and dry at least. Let's go now, or we'll have Goody Willingson angry with us. She's the housekeeper. Does she beat you then? I asked softly as we descended the stairs. Sandra laughed. Mrs. Williamson, she can hardly bear to beat the carpets. And Mr. Pope, does he beat you? Sandra turned to me with a puzzled look. Say, what sort of family are you used to? Family? I said. Mr. Pope was already at the table along with half a dozen young boys, who I later learned were orphans Mr. Pope had taken in. The housekeeper showed no sign of exasperation at our lateness. She merely filled plates and set them before us. The other boys were well behaved except for staring at me, the newcomer. I kept my attention on my plate and tried to ignore them. So, Mr. Pope said, you've run off from your master. I choked down a piece of beef. Will he be content to let you go, or will he come after you? I can't say. In truth, I was certain that should I really desert, Simon Bass would not let me go lightly. He was a man of business, and I suspected he would not like losing the £10 he had invested in me. To such a man I would not be a runaway prentice, but an uncollected debt, and Falconer would be the collector. Well, I can sympathize with you, Mr. Pope was saying. I was apprenticed to a weaver myself before I heard the theatre's siren call. Most of the members of our company, in fact, were destined for some more respectable trade. Mr. Images was to be a goldsmith, Mr. Shakespeare a glover. He looked sternly about at the young children. That is not to say that I condone prentices running off willy-nilly from their masters. You will all be prentices one day, and I expect each of you to work hard at learning your trade, just as I expect Widge here to work hard at becoming a player. He turned his gaze on me again. I gave what I hoped would pass for an eager look and turned my attention to my plate once more. How had I gotten myself into this? Until today there had been but one set of demands upon me. Now 2 threats hung over me, like the buildings in that narrow, stinking alley. Sooner or later they were sure to meet, and I would be caught squarely in the middle, up to my ears in muck water. The bed I shared with Sandra was the softest I had known, and Sandra neither tossed nor snored unduly. Yet I slept fitfully. Once I even rose and began to dress, thinking that the most prudent course might be to run away. But I could not think of anywhere to run. I crept back into bed and lay there contemplating the terrible sorts of fates that seemed possible only in the small hours until matins rang. Though it was not fully light, Sandra and I dressed, breakfasted, and set out for the Globe. I glanced into each alley we passed, half expecting to spy a cloaked figure waiting to spring on me. But of course Falconer had found no way of knowing where I was, and I didn't think he would haunt the vicinity of the theatre. For some reason he had seemed reluctant to show himself there. Probably he feared that someone would guess his purpose. One thing I was sure of, he was still in London somewhere, and still determined to have the script. The thought made me newly determined to have it as a shield against his wrath when he caught up with me, as he surely would. We were far from the first arrivals at the playhouse. Men were busy rethatching the roof behind the stage. Others were carrying pieces of scenery and furniture upstairs and carrying new ones down. Gone was any hope I had harbored of searching for my table book. Players stood or sat in odd corners, talking to themselves, making curious faces and sudden gestures, for all the world like residents of a madhouse. A ruddy-faced young man gave an unexpected sweep of his arm, striking me on the side of the head. I backed away, ready to apologize for getting in the way. To my surprise, the man was the one to offer an apology. "Oh, sorry, didn't see you." He turned to Sandra, waving his script. "Mr. Johnson has kindly provided me with 30 new lines to learn before today's performance. I had difficulty enough recalling the old ones. Sandra patted him on the shoulder. You'll learn them well, you always do, and if you don't, you'll make something up. In a confidential voice he added, something better, no doubt. The man named Will gave a grudging smile. I suppose so. So the performance is on for today? I thought it looked like rain again. You know how they are. Will rolled his eyes upward, as though referring to the gods. But I presumed he meant the men who held shares in the company. We'll go on unless the stage is under water, and even then they'd likely haul out boats and do the Spanish Armada. Sandra laughed. They'll be wanting the stage cleared then. I'll tell you what, I'll learn your lines for you, if you'll clear the stage for me. Will waved him away. Sandra picked up 2 brooms and handed one to me. I glanced back at Will, who was mumbling and gesturing again. Surely that was not Mr. Shakespeare. Sandra gave a laugh that held no disdain, only amusement. Hardly. That's Will Sly. He was apprentice like us a few years ago. Now he's a hired man. You won't see much of Mr. Shakespeare. He's a private man, and a very busy one. But no, you have seen him. I have. He was the ghost in Hamlet. He pulled back the curtain and let me precede him onto the stage. Bereft of players and properties, it bore no resemblance to a castle in Denmark. It was a mere platform of boards covered with damp and dirty rushes. On the ground, 2 boys of about 9 or 10 years of age were gathering discarded beer bottles and smashed fruit. Samuel and James, Sandra told me, are hopefuls. Hopeful of what? Of staying on as prentices. He rolled up his sleeves. Well, let's have at it. We spent the next hour sweeping the heavy mat of soiled and soggy rushes onto the ground, spreading a fresh supply from a wagon over the boards, then loading the old ones on the wagon. By the time we finished, I was as limp and wet as the rushes. I sank down on the edge of the stage. No one told me a player's life would be like this. Sandra gave another good-humored laugh. How could you be so cheerful in the face of such drudgery? We don't do this every day. Some days we clean out the jakes and pile it on the dung heap. I shook my head wearily and silently prayed that I might find the missing table book very soon. When does a white get to be a hired man? When your voice changes. If you're a good prentice, meantime. Sandra picked up his broom. Come, time for lessons. I already ken how to read and write, I pointed out as we climbed the narrow stairs I had scrambled down the day before. Even as I spoke, my eyes were casting about for some sign of my table book. That will be useful, Sandra said, but these are lessons of a different sort. Behind us, as we came up the stairs, was a large room in which a group of players were rehearsing some scene. We proceeded past the drapes on which I had snagged myself. I saw no table book there either. I would have to return later and search more carefully. We stopped outside the door to another room. From within the room came the sound of blows and an occasional cry. I felt a wrenching in my stomach. Whatever lessons lay ahead, they were obviously being driven home with the aid of a willow switch. First hard labour, now beatings. I should have known the theatre would prove to be as heartless and as harsh as any other institution. And that is the end of Chapter 11. Chapter 12. I hung back, very nearly resolved to flee and take my chances with Falconer, had I known where he was, or even on my own in that unknown city. But just then Sandra turned and beckoned to me with such a cheerful and friendly countenance that I swallowed my misgivings and followed him inside the lesson room. The scene within was not at all what I had expected. There were no sullen students lined up on benches with slates in their hands, nor was there any sign of anyone being beaten. The sounds had apparently come from two boys mock sword fighting with wooden single sticks. One was Nick, the fellow who had been the butt of the players' jokes the day before, and who had played the queen in Hamlet. The other was the play's Ophelia, a slender boy no taller than I, and far better suited to playing a girl's parts than the swaggering Nick, who seemed too husky in voice and in build to portray anything but older women. On the other side of the room, two players were dancing a jig to a tune played on a note-boy. Nearby, Samuel and James, the two hopefuls, were turning somersaults atop a row of rush mats under the eye of a small, athletic-looking man. "Mr. Phillips," Sander informed me. "He's our stage manager, among other things. Mr. Armand, you already know." He gestured toward the man who had run afoul of Falconer and who had stood up for me before the other players. He was demonstrating sword positions to Nick and his partner. He nodded in our direction, and Sander approached him. "Where shall I start our new boy?" "Stramazzone!" Mr. Armand shouted, and I shrank back, believing we were being cursed in some foreign tongue. The two students made slicing motions with their sticks. "He may well begin here," Mr. Armand said in a perfectly civil tone. Then he shouted, "Reversa!" The two boys cut with their sticks from the other side. "Get him a single stick." For the next hour I stood in rank with Sander and the others, facing Mr. Armand and attempting to duplicate his stance and movements. I had never had anything to do with weapons, beyond the mock skirmishes with elder sticks at the orphanage. Before long my limbs began to ache. I could sense that the others were secretly laughing at my bumbling efforts, and I longed to throw the stick aside, preferably at them, and show them my skill with a pen. But to do so, of course, would be to give myself away. I would have to continue to seem a willing apprentice until I could complete my real mission here. And when I did, when I had stolen the script from under their very noses, then I would be the one to laugh. At last Mr. Armand called a halt, and he and Nick paired off. Nick was armed with a real rapier now, blunted, of course. They saluted with their swords, their faces smiling and cordial. Then Mr. Armand said, "Have at you," and the two transformed before our eyes into deadly enemies. Their blades clashed and parted and met again with such rapidity that my eye could scarcely follow. Sander and Ophelia cheered them on. Their sentiments were obviously with Mr. Armand, but they shouted encouragement to Nick as well. Even with my ignorance of fencing, I could see that Mr. Armand was holding back, giving Nick time to ward and counter. The fencing scene in the play had been displayed the same measured pace. As with the play, I was drawn into the drama. Just as I was tempted to shout a word of encouragement myself, Mr. Armand effortlessly caught Nick's sideways blow on the guard of his rapier, flung his arm outward, and delivered a quick but gentle staccato to Nick's unguarded chest. "Touch," he said. Nick's face, already red from exertion, grew redder. He peevishly flung down the rapier and stalked off. Mr. Armand ignored his outburst and approached us. "Do you three feel you're ready for a real weapon?" "No, sir," we said, almost as one person. "Then go practice your passatas," he said. "We have an audience who pays to see us. We don't need you lot standing about gawking." As we moved away, Sander said, "Widge is going to need a bit of coaching, I think. Do you want to do it, Julian, or shall I?" Ophelia, whose name was apparently Julian, shrugged. "We could take turns." "All right with you, Widge?" Sander asked. Unused as I was to being asked my preferences, I took a moment to reply. "Oh, I don't mind. But Mr. Armand said—" "Fie on what Mr. Armand said," Sander replied, but softly. I've done so many passatas I could do them in my sleep. Just to be sure you do them on your side of the bed. Just be sure you do them on your side of the bed. He laughed. We'll soon have you doing them in your sleep as well. Now the first thing we'll have to show you is the 3 wards. 3 words? No wards. He held a single stick at the height of his forehead. This is a high ward. I copied his stance. He moved the stick to his waist. Broad ward. His hand went down near his knee. Base word. You might as well show him the right way, Cook, said a voice. I turned to see Nick standing close by. Here, let me have that stick. Sander gave it up reluctantly. Nick planted himself in front of me, a distinctly unpleasant smile on his face. I'll learn you properly. Let him be, Sander said, not as forcefully as he might have. I'm only going to see that he learns his lesson, Nick said insolently. Now then, Widge, is it? You know what a widge is where I come from? My throat felt too tight to speak. I shook my head. A horse. I think I'll call you Horse, though you look more like an ass to me. Hold your stick like this. Horse, the hand close to the knee and the tip pointing at your opponent's throat bowl. With a shaking hand, I tried to mirror his position. Get your point up, he commanded. I was slow to respond, and he whacked my stick sharply. Get the point up, I said. Get the point? I? Do I look like the captain of a ship? Nay. Ah, you can neigh like a horse as well. Now bring your your hand, in closer to your leg, else your opponent might do this. He brought his stick swiftly down on my knuckles with a gasp, and with a gasp I let my stick fall. And if you do that, he'll certainly do this. He lunged and his stick struck my breastbone painfully. My fear gave way to anger, and I scrambled for the other fallen weapon. Laughing, Nick knocked it out of my reach. When I was young at the orphanage and the bigger boys taunted me, I invariably burst into tears. But finding that it was an invitation to further abuse, I had learned to refrain from tears, whatever the provocation. I even prided myself on it. Now, facing Nick, I trembled with shame and frustration, but I was dry-eyed. Pick it up, Horse, Nick ordered me. With his foot he sent it skating across the floor at me. As I hesitated, unsure whether I would look more like a fool by picking it up or by letting it lie, Julian suddenly stepped between us, his stick at Broadwood. That's enough, Nick. We can all see he's no match for you. And you are, I suppose? No, the boy replied evenly, but Sander and I together may be. Nick scowled at Sander, who had taken the cue and come up behind him. That's unfair odds. So is you against Widge, Sander said. Give him a few months of practice, and he'll go around with you, won't you, Widge? Though in truth I meant to be gone long before that. I nodded. Aye. Nick pointed his stick threateningly at me. Study your footwork well, then, Hobby Horse, for I mean to hobble you. He gave a token thrust toward Sander, who jumped back. Laughing, Nick tossed the stick aside and swaggered off. Only then did I notice Mr. Almond watching from across the room. Why did I not put a stop to it? I suppose, Julian said, he believes a man should fight his own battles. Then why did you step in? I said crossly. I beg your humble pardon. Next time I'll let him put a dent in your stupid pudding basin. Julian stomped away. "A bit of a hothead, isn't he?" I observed. "And you're a bit of a muttonhead," Sandra said mildly. He was only trying to help. "I don't need any help," I said sullenly. "Yes, you do. Now, why don't you take up that stick and we'll start over, Highwood?" As I grudgingly strove to mimic his movements, he said, "Nick isn't really such a bad sort, you know. He was just testing your mettle. Broadwood, I don't think Nick is truly mean at heart. He's just going through a bad time. He's been apprentice for 6 or 7 years, and now he'll have to begin playing a man's part. On the stage or in life? Both, I suppose. Lowood." "That's as may be," I said, "but we can scarcely judge a person by what he's like, what is like inside. It's the outside we are to do with." Sander lowered his single stick and sighed. "Well, inside you may be a very good fencer, but on the outside you stink." "I washed but last week," I protested. Sander laughed. "I didn't mean it literally, you goose. It means you're terrible. Come, we'll try some passatas." It was a long morning. When Mr. Armand finally tired of trying to make us into some semblance of scrimers, his word for swordsman, he passed us on to Mr. Phillips, who worked on our diction, mostly mine, and something called projection, which meant, as nearly as I could tell, shouting more loudly than the audience. To my relief, the afternoon was less taxing. The company was presenting a play called Every Man Out of His Humour, which fit my mood exactly. As the bookkeeper was ill, Sander was given the task of holding the playbook and throwing out lines to players who were floundering. I was posted along with Samuel, one of the hopefuls, in the tiring room to help the players change costume. In my ignorance, I did more to hinder than to help, yet none complained except Nick. When I stepped on the hem of his gown, he aimed a blow at me. I ducked it easily, ducking was one athletic skill I had long since mastered. Before he could try it again, his cue came. "I'll see to you later, horse," he growled, and swept out. His voice was so much at odds with his feminine appearance that I could not help snickering. "Such a lady," Sam said, and set us both laughing. Julian came into the tiring room, greeted us, and retreated into the wardrobe to change. I stared after him. Feels a good too for us. Feels a too good for us, does it? Feels a too good for us, does it? Oh, it's nothing against us, Sam said. He's a modest one, is all. Mr. Shakespeare's the same, and Mr. Burbage. Don't like others pawing them, I guess. The mention of Mr. Shakespeare brought to mind something that the day's constant activity had pushed aside, the lost script. If I did not find it soon, someone else would. Leaving Sam to take care of matters in the tiring room, I crept up the stairs to the balcony. My luck was good that day. The balcony was not in use. I drew back the drapery and inspected the spot where I had concealed myself the day before. So much for luck. The notebook was not there. Where in heaven's name was it then? Had some member of the company found it? Then it came to me, the man in the crowd who had jostled me from behind. He had smiled so sincerely it never occurred to me that he had dipped his thieving fingers into my wallet. "Gog's bread," I murmured. "A stolen me script." The thief must have been upset to discover that he had filched not a purse, but a book full of scribbles. He could hardly return it, though, and however great his frustration, it could not have held a candle to his dismay that I felt at that moment, knowing that all my work and worry was for naught. And that is the end of chapter 12. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and grant you his peace.